And then the blue-eyed student lowered a bashful look down, thinking, "No, the eldest priestess. Everything is completely wrong." But then heavy silence increased between them. The girl still continued to squeeze her fist. But then, after a few moments, the girl only shoved her head and gloomily decided to object. "But, mistress, I was defiled. The Lord will not hear my prayers." She understood the girl, imagining how she falls into the fire. The priestess must pray for the well-being of the country and the people. "You must curb your feelings and follow the will of heaven," she said. But then, after a few moments, the girl turned away with bright eyes, telling the priestess, "Fine. That's right, I'm a priestess," the girl thought, leaving the old woman. "She seemed to resemble herself again, and I have to cope with my duties." The girl understood, but suddenly stopped, looking up. "Besides, Hae-mi is now restless," the priestess thought, holding out her hand to the snow on the roofs. He was already falling. Father and son-in-law are absent. What if something happens to the child? She asked Hymen that day, looking at her stomach with worriedly. "I'm not perfect. Will I be able to protect Hymen? Even if there is no certainty, I must follow the will of heaven," she thought. "Perhaps this is my punishment." Suddenly the girl thought, and her gaze immediately changed. He became more decisive. Meanwhile, the snow has already begun to melt. Gradually, the winter ended. The cold retreated away, giving time in spring. The general repeated, "Your Majesty, think again. Did you really call Madame Priestess in the palace?" Blondine's hair was disheveled. He frowned. His bewilderment was visible. He continued to repeat, "It is dangerous." "I know." The emperor interrupted him, looking tiredly at the man in front of him. He just sighed. The brunette frowned. "I know about the essence of the empress. Put the guards to the priestess and follow the empress." Lee said the Hangul. He repeated, "It is necessary to quietly surround and punish the liars. Carefully make sure not to be angry in vain." But then the general reconciled with the words of His Majesty, and therefore agreed tiredly. "In your words, it makes sense." The brunette jumped up, asking, "Is there anyone outside?" The blonde looked with pity at the emperor in front of him. "Find a quick master in the capital and led to build a temple on the territory of the temple." The emperor ordered a certain servant. Finally leaving the imperial hall, the general went out onto the balcony and exhaled heavily. He lowered the eyes of bright eyes. "Will I be able to protect Madame Priestess?" the blonde thought, having muttered these words under his breath. He looked into the distance, but then, after a while, loud sounds of hoof strikes were heard. Some people jumped quickly on horses. "Your Majesty, the sky looks unusual. Let's get back to the palace." Then the general said the emperor ahead, but the man decided to ignore the words of the blonde, and therefore turned away, continuing the path into the distance. His gaze was harsh, and then the emperor suddenly said, "We finish the hunt. We go to the house of Advisor Yu." Blonde turned around. Then the general asked in surprise. He even exclaimed, "What?" The man opened his green eyes wide. "Have you seen the daughter of Advisor Yu at the performance?" the emperor asked. "No, I did not see," he answered. "She is very beautiful." They hit the road. The emperor led them. Su-un thought, "Is his heart similar to an impregnable fortress? Is it finally trembling? What is this girl?" the blonde reasoned while he followed the emperor. He barely smiled, and then a strong pouring rain went. Before the eyes of General Su-un were locked, wooden doors. And then, seeing that girl in front of him, the blonde opened his mouth wide in surprise. He was stupefied and blushed. "Such a beauty," the blonde thought, watching the blue-eyed young girl, whose cheeks were barely reddened. The blonde leaned toward a man, asking, "Listen, this family has only one daughter?" He tried to hide the embarrassment. And then a certain elderly man whispered in his ear to General Su-union, "That girl is Madame Jamen, the second daughter." That girl smiled brightly and laughed. Around her seemed to bloom flowers. The general repeated, "Yu Jamen, Madame Jamen. No, it won't go. This girl was able to touch the heart of the master, whom I vowed to serve the truth," he thought. And then, after some time, hugging the wall, the blonde heard female moans, heavy sighs from the room. "Your Majesty, slow down!" the female voice insisted. The blonde did not dare to move, hiding his hands. Then the general lowered the saddened gaze of the green eyes. He frowned with snow-white eyebrows, and his hair was disheveled. It is necessary to hurry with the election of the empress and the birth of the heir. The advisors were in speech to the emperor. He did not pretend to be listening. The general understood, and they kept repeating, "After you went to the throne, you have never visited a harem." I immediately realized when I saw her with my own eyes why His Majesty's heart trembled. Thinking the blonde. The warm look of this girl seemed to be able to melt even the most ice heart. He thought, standing in the rain, the happiness of His Majesty, which he finally found, to the very end. The general reasoned, squeezing his lips tightly, "I will protect it even at the cost of my life." Then the general decided, clinging closer to the cold walls. But on the wedding day, the general carefully watched two in love when the moment of wedding oaths came. "This is not Madame Jamenne," the blonde thought, looking at the he of men. "Similar, but this is definitely another person." And then the brunette turned around, coming closer to the general, who looked in surprise at the emperor. He led his wife. "Your Majesty," she wanted to exclaim the blonde, holding out his hand to him, but froze, unable to utter a word. This rain is a bad sign, the general thought, looking at the sky. Drops of rains fell from heaven, sprinkling the earth. Then that man raised his head, muttering, "I hope I can stop this storm on my own." Before the eyes of the girl appeared large doors. It seemed as if they were even shining. It was a huge building. She raised the surprised look of bright eyes, examining the whole temple. She carefully studied its scale. "Welcome, Madam Priestess," she said, a certain old woman, and Jamin was surprised, opening her eyes wide. "My name is Jamin. I arrived from the temple," that blue-eyed girl said, and the old woman laughed awkwardly. "I heard about you. I am a maid of honor, Kvak. I serve His Majesty." The elderly woman answered, smiling good. "If you have difficulties, you can contact me," she said. "I am also the mother of the General of the Security, Song Su-un." The old woman kept repeating, "I heard a lot about Madame Priestessa from Su-una. He said that you are an amazing person." Then the girl awkwardly looked down, answering a good elderly woman. "This is too much praise. Do you like this temple?" the old woman asked the girl. Although they built in a hurry, the construction was paid special attention. The old woman kept repeating, "They say that a long time ago, on this is precisely this, our founder prayed to heaven." The girl looked down. "The temple is beautiful. I do not deserve such an appeal. To repay for kindness, I will pray hard," she thought. Then the elderly woman said, "I completely forgot. Let me introduce you to the maid who will take care of you." "My name Men A," answered a certain girl with short black hair. She bowed to Madame Jamenne. The old woman kept repeating, "If you need something, you can ask Men A." The girl answered at any time. "Thank you," she repeated. "This is the order of the emperor, to make sure that the lady does not lack anything. Now that I am in the imperial palace, I cannot avoid meetings with His Majesty." The girl understood. She turned away, thinking, "I'm still not sure if I can pretend that there was nothing. What should I do?" All the time the blonde watched them. He looked out of a small snow-white statue, looking at the girls. The general listened carefully from the dialogue, but when he realized that the conversation was over, he immediately turned from the girls. "I checked everything, Your Majesty." There was a male voice that seemed echoing throughout the building. The blonde insisted, "She has already dismantled her things in the temple." And the brunette listened, grinning. He scratched his chin. "How did she look?" the emperor asked. And the general hastened to answer, "I was a little acrid, but it seems that everything is in order. I think it will be safer to keep it closer to yourself. But for some reason, I am still restless in my soul," the emperor said. The man spoke, implying his wife. She seemed to play with people, as with small dolls. The emperor leaned over, thinking about something, and then muttered, "Obviously, the cunning empress is plotting something. Observe the dowager empress and chill bitch. If it is suspicious, strengthen the protection of the sanctuary," he said. "When will the troops arrive?" the emperor asked. He answered, "They move without attracting attention, about half a month. Before the arrival of the troops, we must receive evidence of the conspiracy," the emperor said. Looking at the blonde, he repeated, Suppose a mistake, and everything can turn against us? The blonde bowed, saying, I will keep in mind. The man's gaze has changed again. His red eyes flashed in the dark, and he screamed, So far, we will not deal with them all. Protect the priestess, so that no hair falls from her head, the man shouted, representing the young priestess in the temple. Madam Priestess, what is it? Someone asked after a while. He pointed to the burning light, which illuminated the night darkness. This is holy water, the girl answered, and her maid carefully watched the actions of the mistress. She tilted her head. Jamin held a cup in her hands, saying, I scored it from an inexhaustible source in the temple. It is necessary for prayers. So, in that vessel, holy water, the maid said, turning her head. The girl smiled brightly, touching the cup. The maid said excitedly, Madam Priestess, you are probably tired of the road today. Go to bed early. You will begin to pray from tomorrow. I prepared a bathtub for you, told Mene. Before Zhao was a bath. And then the blue-eyed girl slowly plunged into warm water, first touching her surface to her surface. I worried that I would face His Majesty in the palace. But he did not even go into the sanctuary, she thought. Then the girl began to let water through her palms, and also thought, Probably I was in vain afraid and worried. The maid came up and asked, Madam Priestess, do you need anything? She answered, Everything is fine. You rest too. As you say, I will be nearby. Call me even at night if you need something, the maid insisted. And then the girl finally lay on a large bed. She bowed her head, tried to fall asleep quickly, but then the girl began to think, looking at the ceiling. Interestingly, if I do not take a step from here, she thought, will it be possible to justify the fact that due to prayer, it is impossible to talk to anyone outside the sanctuary? I can't fall asleep. It seems to be a dream of nightmares, even if I fall asleep. The girl knocked down, grabbing the pillow. But then the girl again tried to fall asleep. She covered her blue eyes, pressed a small fist to her chest. It was dry in the throat. The girl thought, and elegant cuts of windows, furniture appeared before my eyes. The girl rose from the bed. Her gaze of blue eyes was still scattered and sleepy. She pulled her hand, and then the girl closed her eyes, but she whispered barely audible, Men all water. But I thought, there is no need to wake up a tired child. The girl tried to get out of bed, clutching her legs. She was still trying to move away after such a long and strong sleep. The girl looked at the door, as well as at the stack of books that stood near her. Something attracted attention. What's happened? The girl thought, widely packed the bright eyes. She froze in place, unable to move. Someone's breathing? Who is there? The girl thought scaredly, suddenly rising sharply from the bed. She was scared, and then the girl began to bite her lips, thinking, This cannot be. She was clearly very nervous. And then the girl closed her eyes, trying to catch her breath. She shook her head, and the emperor stood behind her. This cannot be. What to do? The girl thought, continuing to stand, frozen. She looked around the room. I cannot continue to stand. Suddenly, the blue-eyed girl realized, lowering her sad and frightened look. But then, after a few moments, the girl suddenly raised her head. It seemed that for a moment she relaxed. But then the girl squinted plaintively eyes. She squeezed her lips even more, as if going to cry. Looking back, Your Majesty? The girl said, clearly surprised. He stood crossing his arms over his chest. He looked at the priestess with displeasure. What does His Majesty do here? She thought, scaredly looking at the silhouette. She hastened to close herself with a cloak. The girl asked, Why don't you sleep at such a time, Your Majesty? You can't be here. He looked at her. The girl leaned, saying, Your Majesty, you cannot recklessly enter the sanctuary. You can bring trouble. Trouble? What do you mean? The brunette asked in bewilderment. Then his eyes ceased to be so harsh. The girl blushed, looking at the indifferent brunette, and then said, Even if you pray, God will not hear. God never heard my prayers. The emperor interrupted, after a moment, and then held out his hand to the priestess, and then he touched the girl's chest, saying, Do you think, if you have not heard so far, then suddenly it will do it now? Then the emperor grinned, and then squinted the red eyes, saying, I am unclean from my very birth. The man gently put his hand on the shoulder of a frightened girl. He said, Therefore, I am not afraid of God. Jamin froze. And then a man with long hair approached her even more. He finally added, Not troubles. The girl was scared. The emperor pressed the girl to the bed, and she screamed, Your Majesty! I will pay for deception even if I have to die. Die? The man asked in amazement. He opened the red eyes wide, as if he had not even believed in her words. The emperor said scaredly, I did not give permission, but you dared to say that you are going to atone for the sin of death? Do you think if you die of your own free will, you will deserve forgiveness? The emperor asked, and the girl froze with bewilderment. The emperor hung over the girl and then viciously told her, There will be no forgiveness until I say that it's over. Then the man rudely took her and his chin. The girl said, Your Majesty, just not in this place. Because the sanctuary? The emperor asked, staggered a little from his beloved. The girl hastened to make excuses. Exactly. She can wake up if you make noise, the emperor said, remembering about the maid in the next room. And then the emperor approached her, saying, If you want to wake her, you can scream as much as you like. If you want everyone to know what we were doing here, the man repeated, and the girl, blushing, looked away from him. He intends to force to pay. Will it stop if I die? She thought, feeling chained. I myself fell into this trap. The girl understood very well, and then the man pulled away from her, barely smiling. This place is the most sacred in the palace. But we are going to do something depraved here, he said. Stop lying to me that you don't like it. After all, I remember everything, the emperor repeated, carefully looking at her. How you reacted when our bodies intertwined, the man repeated, looking at the girl's face reddened with shame. Jamin squinted her eyes, and also tried to hide the embarrassment, thinking, I cannot deny the words of His Majesty. Although I consider it a sin, I'm afraid I will still be happy, the girl reasoned, recalling how she moaned in her arms. Sure, the man said, and then held out his hand to the girl. His attentive red eyes studied her. Although you refuse and say that you do not like it, your body asks for more, he repeated, clutching the priestess's hand. And then the man said indifferently, only slightly squinting his eyes. This time undressed herself. His hair was disheveled. From these words, the young priestess blushed even more, squeezing and biting her lips. She was clearly very ashamed and unusual. Then, after a few moments, the girl bashfully lowered her eyes. She barely squinted her eyes, thinking, but then the young priestess tightly squeezed light eyes. A small drop of sweat from excitement was already flowing across her face, and then the girl began to quickly undress, without opening her eyes. First, she took off her purple cloak. Do you want me to push them out? Suddenly the man asked, looking at the girl in front of him. He was barely surprised. Outside the window, there were high roofs of houses. The snow was already settled on many trees, covered the slopes of the mountains. Sister, you're for the first time in the palace. You are still uneasy? The empress asked, and Jamin answered, Not at all. The brunette repeated her sister. When we are together, leave the formalities. We are sisters. The girl immediately fell silent. Hey, Men smiled, touching the chin. She said, Sorry, sister. Because of me, you had to arrive in the palace. In response, Jamin smiled awkwardly. She scored shyly at the girl in front of her. Please do not say that. The blue-eyed priestess looked at the stomach of her sister. She hugged him, and she thought, Her stomach looks more. Hey, Men said, Sister, please pray to me to give birth to a prince. I can protect myself only by giving birth to a prince. What should I do? The blue-eyed girl thought, lowering a bashful look in the floor. She sighed heavily, and then the girl began to squeeze her lips. She thought, I can't directly look at Hymen, who wears the emperor's child. His Majesty will protect you, the girl said, looking up again at the sister with red, harsh eyes. I should not be an obstacle, the girl thought, again lowering her eyes on her belly of Her Majesty. She barely frowned. It is impossible for he to fall out of disgrace because of my lies. If I accept anger, he of me will be in order, she thought. The empress looked at her sister, smiling. But it looked like a girl simply hid anger. There is no one in the imperial palace who would support me. Only a sister on my side, she said. But the blue-eyed girl looked at her sister in bewilderment, saying, I will do everything possible, Your Majesty. Do not mix me, the Empress thought, raising the distraught gaze of the red eyes to her sister. They seemed to sparkle. Disgusting! Do you think it is not known that the Emperor often visits the sanctuary? He thought, taking her hand. But suddenly, there was a sonorous voice that repeated, His Majesty Emperor enters! Both girls were surprised. That man again looked cold and detached. He cast a harsh gaze of red eyes on two sisters nearby. You came, Your Majesty, the brunette said, barely smiling, and the other girl immediately fell to her knees. The Empress held out her hand to Jamin, saying, Sister, do not bow. You can get standing. She closed her eyes. This is impossible. The blue-eyed priestess answered, frowning. Her Majesty sighed heavily, looking at her sister. Then the priestess closed her eyes again, squinting them. She thought as if beating, I do not want to meet his gaze. Madam Priestess, why don't you rise? The Emperor asked, coming closer to the girl lying at his feet. The Empress answered, Sister is not the maid of honor of the imperial palace. Even if she is a priestess, she has no status. Therefore, how does she dare to raise her head before the Emperor? The girl with red eyes asked. Isn't I right, Your Majesty? The brunette asked, and then smiled cordially, covering her red eyes. The Emperor was very angry with these words. Vienna appeared on his face when he looked at the priestess again. What nonsense! The Emperor suddenly answered, raising an indifferent look at his wife. Curls were broken out of the hairstyle. The sister of the Empress should not fall in front of me, her son-in-law. His Majesty, said the Emperor. Hey, men studged. Then the Emperor said in a calm voice, Madam Priestess, stand up. No need to kneel in front of me. The girl raised her frightened gaze of bright eyes. She clearly felt embarrassed, was scared by the actions of a man. And then, Her Majesty the Empress turned the irritated gaze of red eyes to her sister, biting her lip. The brunette exclaimed, But this is against the rules, the Emperor answered. From the moment the priestess entered the palace, everything went not according to the rules, the man added, looking at the angry Empress. She was already trembling with anger. What to do? Because of me, Hai Men is in a difficult position. He thought Jamin, clenching her fists. He men should not fight due to my actions, she thought, starting slowly to get up from the cold floor. And then the girl with blue eyes turned away, as if hiding her head. Like this, the Emperor said, looking at her. Then the man grinned, looking away. He finally asked, So what did Madame Priestess and Empress talk about? The Empress calmly answered, stroking her stomach. I asked my sister to pray to God for the prince to be born healthy. That's how. And what does the priestess think about this? The Emperor asked, looking at the cup of holy water behind. The Emperor barely smiled, asking, Do you think my son will be born? Then the man frowned, waiting for an answer. Madam Priestess raised a bewildered look at the Emperor in front of her, and then decided to ask the man. How can I, a simple person, can know? The girl asked, putting her hand to her chest. The Empress looked at her irritably. If the priestess reading the will of heaven does not know, then who can? He asked, grinning. He looked at the Empress. I'm just curious. If the Empress does not give birth to my son, the Emperor reasoned, and his gaze seemed fading, should then give birth to a concubine? The man asked the surprised girls. They opened their eyes wide. Should then give birth to his concubine? The Emperor asked, and Jamin realized. That's why Haman asked me to help. The Emperor said, Pray for heaven that my son must be born. Jamin answered, I will try my best. The man bowed his head and also smiled. He said, In this case, since I saw with Madame Priestess, I will go. Then the Emperor asked calmly, Empress, will you remain to pray with the priestess, or will you return to the palace? I was just about to return. The brunette answered, displeased. She frowned, and Jamin was scared. And then, as if ignoring the words of his wife, the Emperor averted the attentive gaze of the red eyes. Rest, Madame Priestess, the Emperor repeated, looking at the bewildered blue-eyed girl. She was surprised at the appeal. Then that brunette barely smiled, saying, Looking at your face, it seems that you could not fall asleep last night. These words, especially for me to hear, the girl reasoned, opening her frightened eyes wider. She frowned. It is not easy to fall asleep in the palace. Perhaps throughout the time, there will be problems with sleep in the palace. He insisted. Just know that I'm extremely upset, the emperor repeated. But after a few moments, Jamin was left alone. Your Majesty? Your Majesty? They kept repeating people around again and again, but the man did not seem to notice them. But then, after some time, General Su-un, who said, approached the emperor. Your Majesty, you must go. I thought a little. The emperor answered. Su-yun thought. He can spend more than 1 hour plunged into thoughts. Your Highness! Your Highness, where are you? A certain boy with snow-white hair shouted, walking through the forest. It was a kind of boy of about 12, who wandered among the green thickets and was looking for His Highness. And then the little boy finally saw a familiar silhouette in front of him. The brunette was sitting on the stone, looking up. But seeing his friend, the prince smiled brightly, saying, Su-un! When did you come here? The blonde came closer. Su-un said displeasedly, as if thinking and forgot about the time. Mother was worried about you. He clenched his fist. Then the boy got up, not stopping smiling. Exactly, let's go. And the general thought, recalling, we have grown together since childhood. His Majesty and I are not brothers, but grown by one woman. We were closer to blood relatives. He thought. He had 3 mothers. He thought, recalling how the old woman cursed. And they missed dinner. You make the servant worry. I missed dinner once, think. The nanny is too worried, isn't it, Su-un? The young brunette asked playfully. The first mother of the Kvak. My mother. There was a mother who left the world after his birth, recalled Su-un, and growing His Majesty as the adopted son of Empress Ja-mak. The man remembered their family. Therefore, we, fed by one milk and together taking the first steps, were always together. He reasoned. That is why some people called me the dog of His Majesty or his shadow. The blonde reasoned, following him. What did you think about? The blonde asked. And the emperor frowned again, looking far into the distance. A suitable person does not come to mind. The emperor answered when he ran his hands behind his back. The blonde asked, the place of advisor you. Do you think who should be appointed? The emperor asked, looking away from a friend. The blonde looked away, the eyes of the bright eyes to the side, asking, it will not be better to leave this place empty a little more? All eyes are overwhelmed with greed because of the desire to get this place. You removed the advisor early, he said. The emperor cut off sharply. On the contrary, too late. But the blonde answered, there are still many people of the advisor at the court. Naturally, in the old tree, the roots are deeply launched, he said. To tear them completely, it will take time, the emperor repeated. Uncle's relatives have an army. He is the adopted son of the Dowager Empress and is connected with his mother. We should not hurry in this matter. He insisted the blonde, but thoughtfully told the emperor. But, Your Majesty, he repeated, do you think the advisor to conspiracy with the Dowager Empress? Chil Hwon united with the Empress. But the advisor has not yet betrayed himself? General Su-un asked again. And from thoughts about this, the veins swelled at the emperor. The man who deceived and sent the 3rd daughter to the palace. You say I have to believe him? He asked. No, I did not mean that. The blonde answered immediately, frightened by the disclosure of green eyes. He was clearly perplexed. The emperor asked, what is more important? There will be no problems when protecting the temple. Su-un answered, I ordered how to guard. That little girl is also from your detachment? The emperor asked, recalling a small maid in the house of the priestess. She looks young, so he will pretend to be 16th. She is one of the best. Su said Su. The emperor answered joyfully. Great, I can be calm thanks to you, the blonde said. Thank you. Then the emperor turned around, throwing the general behind. Okay, let's go. I saw that the priestess is in order. This is enough. And then, after a few moments, the blonde did not dare to move from the place. He looked with pity after the emperor. Then, a man with snow-white hair turned around, looking at the house behind him. It was the temple of the young priestess. Su-un plunged into memories. In distant childhood, He once ran to his mother, saying, "He cries alone." Mother leaned over and stroked the crying child, saying, "They say that if you have nothing to cry about, you have no heart. You will not get sick of this. Therefore, when His Highness cries, cry with him," she said, putting her hand on her shoulder. "Or pretend that you know nothing," Mother said. And the blonde again recalled the poor, crying prince. Now I do not know why he was crying then. I know that at that time he had many reasons for tears, thought Soo-eun. His Majesty, who until that moment does not know anything but tears, I hope it will now be happy. The general thought. Finally, a girl appeared who could make him happy. He thought, following the emperor. And she is now in the imperial palace. I recalled the blonde. From his gaze at the temple, he was immediately embarrassed. The girl to whom His Majesty gave the heart. When I saw for the first time, I understood the feelings of the emperor. The general thought, being always indifferent to women, he never even made a question of political marriage. The general reasoned, "It seems that I had what I want to get, even if I have to give the throne for this." The emperor said. Soo-eun was amazed, thinking, what significance the place of the emperor has for His Majesty is well known. He wanted to get her, so that he was ready to abandon everything. She completely took possession of his heart. He understood. Following him, the blonde suddenly thought about something. It seems that now I know what it feels like to be in love, in a person to such an extent. The man reasoned, and suddenly began to squeeze and bite his lips. He squeezed his jaw. "Why are you going slowly?" "We play like a turtle," the emperor said, looking back at the blonde behind. "Not at all, Your Majesty," the blonde answered, sharply straightening his clothes. He sighed heavily and went to the emperor. If an obstacle arises in his way, whatever it may be, His Majesty will certainly overcome everything. He understood. Go to her. Although a hurricane can stuck along this path, but after a hurricane, the sky becomes clearer. He thought, from birth we were together. The blonde thought, recalling how he laughed even next to the little child. Madame Kvok was not initially a maid of honor in the palace. Mother was the wife of a dream cane, general. He remembered. Also, my mother was the friend of the lady, the mother of His Majesty's mother. He thought, remembering his childhood earlier. It coincided that our mothers were pregnant and gave birth to it about the same time. They talked well, thought Soo-eun. My father, General Sun, went to conquer the northern lands and fell in battle 3 days before birth. He reasoned. Mother gave birth to me, mourning my father. The man reasoned, representing the bitter tears of a woman. But the tragic events did not end there. The mistress he could not recover after childbirth. He thought, being at death, the lady he appointed my mother, the prince's nurse. The guy reasoned, presenting his friendship. Therefore mother, taking with her, born 20 days ago, entered the imperial palace. He remembered. The man finally stopped plunging into memories and reasoning. A certain voice exclaimed, Your Majesty! Important message from the general? The servants exclaimed, falling in front of the emperor. Soo-eun! From Ohaima. I listened. He had not even arrived in the northwest lands. The blonde reasoned, overheard. This man starts something again. Immediately, I realized the blonde, squeezing my lips tightly. He was angry and therefore frowned. But then, reading an important message from about him, the emperor barely grinned. His face covered the jewelry. He wants to withdraw troops. Suddenly, the brunette said, And General Soo-eun fro in place, not even daring to move. Soo-eun exclaimed, But you can't allow. This is an excuse that due to insufficient preparation, it is necessary to return the troops. The emperor answered, More recently, I spoke about the concubine. They decided to hurry with the plan until it was too late. Oh, him, this traitor, the blonde thought, lowering his head down. He frowned with white eyebrows, feeling disappointment. The general is one of the few to whom the emperor trusted and appointed. I believed him, recalled Soo-eun. His Majesty, I about him, were 3 close by age and got along well with each other. I recalled the blonde. Once I considered him a reliable person who can trust life. He thought, remembering the murdered hare. His Majesty told not to believe anyone. I considered Hima a man worthy of trust. He remembered Soo-eun hunting. On the battlefield, He repeatedly came to the rescue of His Majesty. Once he saved the life of the emperor. He remembered. His Majesty also trusted in him, and this man betrayed him. He thought Su-un, introducing them to a conspiracy. If him told the truth, if he said that the girl who liked the emperor, the eldest of the twins, he thought, it would not have reached that. He realized the blonde, remembering the moment when the emperor said, I saw that the priestess is in order. Meanwhile, the blue-eyed priestess still prayed, covering her lovely eyes. She tried to concentrate, but the maid suddenly turned to her, barely bowing. That girl asked, Madam Priestess, what's wrong with you? Everything is in order. Nothing happened. The girl answered, turning her head to the maid. She tried to smile absent-mindedly. The girl turned away. With a sigh, she thought, I am still far from the priestess. In the midst of prayer, I don't think about that. The priestess closed her eyes again, squinting them. She pursed her lips, thinking. However, for some reason, I have a bad foreboding. The girl looked at the windows behind her. Behind the building was a green garden, and a blue-eyed priestess thought, If you think so, after that time, I did not hear anything about my father. The girl thought, again distracting from prayer. On that day, her older sister said in a severe voice, putting her hand to her chest, Father left the place of the advisor. Is everything all right with him? The blue-eyed priestess thought, looking at the bamboo behind the glasses of this temple. What brought you here? Suddenly, someone rang out. Father Hymen sat on the red sofa, smiling softly. Can you leave the house so carelessly? She asked Hymen, and then a smile from her father's face immediately disappeared. Father came to see his daughter. Is this a problem? It does not seem to be glad. The man repeated, but he did not even sit down at the table. I do not need his help, she thought, saying, The imperial detachment is observing. You must be more careful. And then the elderly man barely smiled. He squinted light eyes, watching such a young girl. The role of my father is finished to reduce me with Chil Hwon and make me an empress. I understood Hymen. For Chil Hwon, a bitch stands a dowager empress. Removing the emperor, she will temporarily take the throne. Hymen thought, but when I give birth to my son, everything will change. The empress thought, having bitten her lip again. She was nervous and crumpled them. Hymen thought, when this happens, they plan to get rid of me, using my son's power to get power. But I'm not going to give up so easily. The empress reasoned with red eyes, extending a fragile hand. In this situation, a court and power that lost its place, the father is nothing more than a hindrance. The empress reasoned, looking at him, and then the girl joyfully asked, Have you heard any news from the son-in-law? And I thought, the son-in-law can be used. An elderly man bowed his head, and then told his daughter, I heard that they have not yet reached their destination. Before the northwest lands, the path is not short. In a confusion, Hymen, realizing, there is no need to go so far. The army is subordinate to the general. He can deploy the army and come to my aid. She understood. Then the girl gently stroked her stomach, telling her father, it would be nice he would return with the victory in early summer when the child is born. Then the elderly man carefully told the empress, I heard that your sister came to the palace. The brunette sighed in confusion, widely and innocently opening the red eyes. She took a confused gaze to the side. The girl squeezed her hands, thinking, has he really stopped his recluse and arrived at the palace because of her? The man bowed his head and frowned. He looked strict, asking, Why is your sister in the palace? For the sake of prayers, of course. For me and my child. The empress answered, smiling cordially. She pressed her hand to her chest. Father screamed, You said that the emperor suspects you. What are you going to do by calling your sister to the palace? Now they moved back to the temple. The man demanded, but the girl cut off, frowning. This is impossible. And then the man jumped up, exclaiming even louder, Are you going to obey your father? He was angry. Father! Suddenly the girl said, covering her red eyes and irritably. She frowned very much, listening to him. It was my decision. I am the empress, the girl said, looking at an elderly man in front of her. How long should I obey you? The girl asked. And the advisor looked at her fearfully, asking, Do you still see a small child in me? The brunette asked mockingly, frowning her eyes again. An elderly man listened in surprise, opening bright eyes. He was clearly scared by his own daughter. I am the empress of this country, and my word is a law, the girl said sternly, putting her hand to her chest. She was cruel, but then the man bowed his head, frowning even more. They seem to burn in a fire, he said. That's stupid. It is useless to be so angry, father, the girl was thinking. She smiled at the man, as if a madman looked. Father was afraid that a spineless sister would take the side of her husband and did not make her an empress, she thought. On the contrary, I am quite selfish, so I thought that I would follow his will. The empress thought, smiling. Father, you were mistaken, Hymen suddenly said, and the man flinched. As you said, I first of all think about myself. What are you saying? Immediately led the sister to leave the palace, the man exclaimed, hitting the table with his fists. He got up, saying, Although I don't know what you are going to do using my sister, I will not just sit back. Are you serious, father? Mockingly asked the girl, covering her impudent smile with her hand. She smiled. Then the girl said innocently, Are you afraid that I am the cause of the sister? No, why should I do something like that? An elderly man lowered his harsh look, answering his daughter. You didn't forget that I know your secret? Remember that I have the strength to deprive you of this place, the advisor Yu said, and the empress looked sternly at him. So it will be better for you and for the child in your womb, the man said, and the walls of the girl seemed to begin to crumble. Hymen began to stroke the stomach slowly, seeing off the man. It's hard for me, so I can't get up. Goodbye, father. And as soon as the elderly father left the room, the girl's gaze of the girl immediately changed. He became colder. She looked at the flowers, muttering under her breath. You say you can still get rid of me? It's even funny. So it will not go. You need to make it clear that I am no longer a child. She rapped. And outside the window of the house, Wuhan Ryan was snowing. A certain man sighed heavily, and then slowly put a certain cup of drink on a wooden table. An elderly man drank a hot drink, covering his eyes. Then he thought, I did not think that everything would turn so. Then, after a few moments, an elderly man decided to look out the door, looking at the neighboring house. And then the father remembered how two small twins fled to him, and he repeated, Jamen, Hymen, come up. 10 years have passed since both girls hugged the father, and he said, These children, did you play calmly? The elder and I played pebbles. I won! Hymen proudly said, not ceasing to smile joyfully, hugging him. And then, smiling, the man asked, That's how. Jamench, have you also won once? The girl awkwardly turned away. Jamin smiled, saying, I could not play with the sisters. I read the book that my father bought last time. I offered my sister to play together, Hymen exclaimed, and the father finally lowered them to the ground. That's how. Then the man smiled, asking, Who has read the whole book yourself? The one that I bought to read to you? And then the girl seemed to be scared. She opened the blue eyes widely, saying, Sorry, it was so interesting. Here. The elderly man muttered, awkwardly leaning toward the girl. He was confused for a moment. No need to apologize for it. What you read yourself is worthy of praise, the father said, hugging his daughter by the shoulders. And Hae-mi remained behind them. She only whispered quietly, Father. And the man continued to hug only her sister. And then the little girl got angry. She squeezed her lips tightly and also opened the red eyes wide. Suddenly, she turned around and cried out, Book, think! Father loves only the sister of Jamen. Jamen, scared again, ran after her sister, saying, He! Everything is completely wrong. And the little girl cried. But the man only claimed bright eyes, looking at the tears of his youngest daughter. He looked dissatisfied. Yes, Jamen has always loved books very much. The elderly man recalled how the girl turned over the pages. Read again? The advisor Yu asked, once again going to the girl. She answered, Have you finished with business? Then, he said displeasedly, You only do all the days that you read, missing time for marriage, he thought. Although a smart but meek, naive child only disappointed, reproaches for no reason became commonplace. Once, the father said, You are obliged to attend the festival in the palace. This is important. Take care of what to wear. No, perhaps it is better to leave everything as it is. Suddenly the father thought and said, "It doesn't matter, you can go." She agreed. For several months, I am considering the plan, and eventually decided to choose a he of two from them. The advisor recalled. Unlike what I thought, the emperor chose Jamen. The father recalled their loving glances. The emperor seeing something special in Jamen, what Hymen does not have. It was unpredictable, he reasoned. He muttered, I wonder how much Jamen lasts in the palace. You need to take measures, rather. Before Hymen does something, the advisor reasoned, and he thought, hey. True, my father knows my secret. The girl was nervous and began to bite her nails and thought, he will not be so easy to reveal it, as he himself is involved. The empress said, send a person to the prince and pass it that I want to secretly meet him. The maid understood. Hey, men went under her breath, standing up from a chair. Still, you can't let off such a father with it, she reasoned. The prince can deal with the father, but what to do with the sister? The empress thought, starting to walk around the room. It may still be beneficial. The girl understood. Meanwhile, behind the walls of a small temple lay snow. Men, the candle was almost burned out. Jamin said, looking at the candle, which was as if shaking in glass walls. Gentleman priestess, now I will bring another. The maid said, and then she added, capture more incense. Such a smart child. It cannot be that she does not understand what was happening. Madam Priestess reasoned. What we do with His Majesty at night. The girl reasoned, starting to pray again. She closed her eyes. If this continues, hey, Meg will know about everything. She understood the blue-eyed priestess, suddenly deciding to stop the prayer. Then the girl squeezed the hem of the dress with all her might, thinking, no, it is impossible to allow he-men to find out. How to stop His Majesty? The girl thought, lowering the saddened gaze of piercing eyes. He-men lay in bed, and also spoke. I think His Majesty will go to his sister today. Let them have fun. After all, for this I called my sister to the palace. The empress muttered, and anger and hatred burned in her gaze. While His Majesty is in love with her, he will not take concubines. She reasoned, looking at the night sky. She smiled, saying, be that as it may, the main thing is to prevent him from visiting the harem until I give birth to my son. The biggest obstacle for my plan is a harem. The empress reasoned, looking at the flowers nearby. She spoke angrily. Until I give birth to my son, you need to do everything so that the emperor does not choose a concubine. Of course, I can give birth to a daughter. But several pregnant women were collected in the prince's palace. She reasoned. In extreme cases, we can simply change children. The empress understood, introducing pregnant girls. The strength of the family of the concubine is threat. I will not be safe after choosing a concubine, even giving birth to my son. She understood. Therefore, you cannot allow the concubine. The girl kept repeating, and her gaze was cold. But then she grinned angrily, and also frowned, saying, that's why the sister of Jamen is needed. The sister will never tell the truth, and His Majesty, until his death, will not know that he was deceived. She said, hey, men said, he is mistaken, thinking that he can make his sister change his mind because of his whim. Be that as it may, apparently, His Majesty will never look at me in the future. The girl understood. He never paid attention to me, but as soon as she entered the palace, he immediately rushed like a beast. She thought, well, I suggested that. The girl spoke, looking at the room with dull lighting candles. Why is she, not me? The empress reasoned, lowering the distracted gaze of scarlet eyes. She frowned. Why is this a sister, not me? The empress reasoned, recalling the fragile and innocent image of a young, nondescript girl. Hey, men told. She was not better than me in anything. All the time she hid behind me, she could not look into the eyes of people. How did she dare, insignificant, to pick up His Majesty, who was supposed to become mine? The brunette reasoned. Just wait and see what I'm going to do. They will not take anything from me. They will not take it for anything, she screamed. After some time, it was already starting to light outside the window. Bright rays of the sun illuminated snowdrifts, soya on the trees. Yesterday's night has become the fourth. Thinking Jamen, not stopping praying. She tried to concentrate, It is no longer possible to allow His Majesty to come to the temple. She understood the blue-eyed priestess, blushing again. Why can't His Majesty leave me alone? The girl thought, looking at incense. I know that this should not be, but my heart continues to strive for His Majesty. Her hands began to tremble. Is this the punishment that I have to bear? But the foe is too cruel, the girl thought, sitting on her knees on the floor. Then the girl again continued the prayer, this time not being distracted by unnecessary thoughts. But then she opened her eyes again, thinking, it would be better if he took my life in the heavenly temple. And then, suddenly, the door to the room to the girl with a ringing creak opened. Bright light illuminated the floor of her room. The girl turned around in surprise, looking at the uninvited guest in front of her. She opened her eyes wide. The emperor came in, asking, What did you do, Madam Priestess? Soozing, the girl later drew him in. Why did His Majesty come at such a time unaccompanied? The girl thought, looking at him in bewilderment. The priestess thought, moreover, in this form, like a completely different person, not the one that came last night. However, I know that this is his fake look. No, rather I don't know what kind of person he is, she thought. What is his personality? What is his character? What is he thinking about? I don't know anything about him, the girl realized. I fell in love with His Majesty, seeing only his face. The young priestess reasoned, shyly looking away. Was I really careless that, not knowing the essence of a person, I turned out to be an enchanted appearance? She thought. The emperor said, The lady is sure that if every day to pray so sincerely, then her prayers will reach heaven? What is he? A wise ruler thinking about the country? She thought, answering, Heaven always hear all prayers? Or a cruel tyrant, eager for power? She thought. And the man asked, How many answers have you already received? Can I still admire them? Jia thought, and he asked, Is prayers something else than comfort? Everything is completely wrong. Madam Priestess answered irritatedly, and the emperor came even closer to her. Okay, get up and take my hand, the emperor said, holding out a free palm for the girl. Is there a reason why you cannot do this? Suddenly, a man with scarlet eyes asked. She was surprised. Was His Majesty so affectionate? Suddenly the girl thought, carefully grabbing the man's hand. His voice was crowded with love, and the look turned on me was so warm. She thought, namely, I fell in love not only in the appearance of His Majesty, but also of his good disposition. That girl reasoned, Madam Priestess, did you examine the palace? The emperor asked, but the girl, as if spellbound, looked at him. Then Madame Priestess lowered her head and answered the emperor. No, I did not arrive in order to admire the palace. And then the emperor suddenly asked, looking down. So, you did not see the bamboo forest in the yard behind the temple? In winter, this bamboo forest is a beautiful place in the palace. Let's take a walk there together, he asked. And then the girl again averted the eyes of bright eyes. She sighed heavily, and the emperor smiled brightly. Are you going to refuse? He asked the man with red eyes, grabbing her palm harder. He began to sort out his fingers. Already, after some moments, they together walking the bamboo forest behind the temple, talking. They walked very close, almost grow up for each other. The girl carefully examined the trees, foliage, and then the man suddenly took the girl's hand. The same wanted to object to a trembling voice. Your Majesty, my hand. Please let go, the priestess timidly said, and the emperor immediately interrupted her. Your face is more emaciated. He was polite in the temple, but as soon as he entered the forest, she thought, and he continued, This is not because you are in the temple all the time? Then the emperor added, You should at least sometimes walk like that and breathe air. Xiamen was surprised, for priestesses in the order of things spend all the time in the temple, the girl answered, sharply turning away from the man. She thought, Does His Majesty know the real reason why I am very exhausted? That's how. In this case, until what time? The emperor finally decided to ask, barely stepping back from the girl. Are you going to continue to be a priestess? The man asked, suddenly leaning closer to the girl. What? The girl was clearly perplexed, and therefore asked, thinking, What does it mean? She opened her eyes wide. What do you want to say? The girl asked awkwardly. And the man came closer to her, squeezing his palm tightly. Entering the heavenly temple and becoming a priestess, the girl should live like this until his death, she repeated, and the silhouette ran from behind. Didn't you know, Your Majesty? The girl asked, and a certain person hastened to hide behind them. You think I ask because I don't know? Then the emperor asked, barely grinning. He looked at her. The sin that you have done. Suddenly the emperor reminded with red eyes, and the girl was scared. The man finally said, How long will you deceive others, doing the work of the priestess? This is what I mean. Then the girl looked at the grass, in which lovely flowers grew. In some places, snow lay. This! The blue-eyed girl hastened to make excuses, wide opening her eyes from fright. The emperor interrupted her. He asked, Even sinning, you are going to shamelessly pretend that there was nothing and live deceiving people? Then the girl immediately turned away from the emperor, hiding a bashful look. She, stuttering, answered, This is wrong. Then the man leaned over and mockingly asked the girl, In this case, you should not stop being a priestess? Jimin answered, When I finish with prayers here and I will return to the heavenly temple, I'm going to tell the older priestess. The priestess who has committed sin is kicked out of the temple. I can return to my stepfather's house, but I can't get married. She understood. All my life I will live under the name of a repentant sinner, not appearing to anyone. She thought. She resolutely kept repeating, As soon as Her Majesty gives birth safely, I will return to the temple and tell you about my sin. The girl squeezed her fist with all her might, continuing to speak. Then I will hide in my father's house, and I will live quietly. The blue-eyed priestess lowered her saddened gaze, realizing, I have sinned, and even now continue to do it. Until His Majesty stops punishing me, my body will be defiled, she thought. Even if in the end sin will absorb me, my lie put the beginning of this. It seemed to squeeze blood from it. She understood. Therefore, I must be responsible, the girl thought. And the emperor said, This will not take much time. What? What are you talking about? The girl asked perplexedly, raising a surprised look at the emperor. Perhaps this is for the first time when I see the face of His Majesty is close in detail. The girl understood, examining. A person who inspires me with fear and treats me with hostility. Why do I see him beautiful? The priestess thought. She thought. This moment, when I, standing under a bright sunlight and a cool breeze, can consider it. Will he repeat it again? The blue-eyed girl thought. Looking at her lover with pity, she thought, Why heaven created him so beautiful. The emperor said, You will not stay priestess for long. A man with scarlet eyes put his hand on her shoulder and then said again, After all, I will force you to discard this name. The man continued to reason aloud. Priestess? What kind of absurdity? The girl looked at the emperor bewildered. Suddenly, she looked at the bright eyes, as if finally thought about something. Then the girl sighed heavily. It's too much. Suddenly said the girl, barely whispered these words. It seemed to have frozen at that moment around. What did you say? The emperor asked immediately, and the girl hastened to answer him. You are too cruel, she said. I know very well about what I did. As soon as I finish praying for the sake of Her Majesty, I will leave the temple. The girl repeated, I am ready all my life without seeing sunlight and not meeting with anyone, to repent of sin. I am not saying that I did not do anything bad, and yet. The priestess continued to speak, and her whole body began to shake. His Majesty every day reminds me of sin. He wounds, strangles to such an extent that I cannot breathe. Your Majesty, maybe you. The strong-eyed girl began, and the man in response only squeezed his jaw. Do you want me to break up with life right now and disappear from your eyes? The girl asked, starting to cry. If His Majesty wishes such repentance, I will do it, she repeated, and the emperor looked at her indifferently. What did you say? Suddenly the man asked, watching the drops of tears that drained from the cheeks of a young girl. Will you take your life yourself? The emperor asked again, hanging over the unfortunate, frightened by the priestess. The man repeated again and again, Will you disappear from my eyes? He immediately averted the eyes of Scarlet Eyes. His anger was visible. Then the man sharply grabbed the girl by the hand, and she sighed heavily. She did not even resist his actions. The emperor abruptly pulled the girl into his arms. The blue-eyed priestess looked up at him. She opened her eyes wide, and then, stuttering, awkwardly turned to the emperor in front of herself. "Your Majesty!" The brunette squeezed his wrist with the blue-eyed priestess to pain and reddened bone. She exhaled, but the man did not let go. Then the girl tried to pull away, clutching the blue eyes. But then the man only approached her. And then the girl looked at the flowers that were next to His Majesty. They looked lovely. Then the man said, squeezing the jaw tightly, "You can't do anything, neither die nor disappear." He frowned. And then the emperor hugged the girl by the waist, pressing his beloved even closer to him. She stopped trembling. "Until I allow it," the emperor whispered, leaning even closer to the girl. He took her second hand. Then the man leaned even closer to her. The emperor buried his face in the soft, captivating hair of the girl. But then the man again pulled away from her, pressing the body of the blue-eyed priestess to the bamboo tree trunk. And then a man with scarlet eyes kissed her. He watched her alarmed, and the priestess closed his eyes. Then the emperor barely lagged behind, giving them a little time to catch his breath. But the girl reached for him again. After a few moments, the man himself deepened the kiss, and the girl only sighed languidly, succumbing. The man did not stop kissing the girl gently, not letting her hands out of his tenacious grip. The priestess stretched to him. Meanwhile, a candle burned brightly in some place, even despite the fact that the window was still a high sun. "I understand, you can go," a certain voice said. There was a certain old woman in front of them, who did not bow deeply. "So impatient in the morning. So now he is going to openly visit the temple?" She asked Demines, and a prince was sitting nearby. The green-eyed brunette smiled, asking, "Why are you not in the mood? On the contrary, you should rejoice." Then that brunette grinned nastily, saying the empress, "Everything goes exactly as we planned. All because his actions are so disgusting that I cannot look at it. By the way," the empress said, "there is something that you will have to do." The girl said, lying in bed with the prince. "What did you talk about?" A girl with scarlet eyes kept repeating, looking at the vase with flowers. "We must do earlier than we thought. Father raised the noise due to the fact that I called my sister to the palace. He is like a tiger without teeth. Insignificant," she said. High castle by the sun. Bright rays shimmered on its roofs, reflecting the glare of the patterned building. A certain person hastily headed somewhere. His steps were quick and wide. He was paid for gray clothes. It was the emperor. The blonde asked him, "Why didn't you tell the truth?" The man suddenly stopped, frozen. General Su-un was worried. "She must be confused, Madam Priestess." His eyes seemed to sparkle.